This episode asks perhaps the most important question of the entire African Civilisations series. Not whether Africa can unite, but who benefits if it never does. For generations, Africans have been taught to fear one another. Colonial borders divided peoples who had traded, married, and cooperated for centuries. Apartheid perfected divide and rule. Post-colonial politics often continued it, replacing solidarity with suspicion. Today, that same logic appears in xenophobia, regional rivalries, visa barriers, and narratives that present fellow Africans as threats instead of partners. But imagine the alternative. Imagine an Africa where Nigerian technology powers Kenyan innovation, South African industry partners with Congolese minerals, Ethiopian manufacturing serves West African markets, and Ghanaian finance invests across the continent. Imagine African universities sharing research, businesses building continental supply chains, and young Africans seeing opportunity in each other instead of competition. That vision is not fantasy. The African Continental Free Trade Area represents the largest free trade area in the world by number of participating countries. Africa has over 1.4 billion people, the world's youngest population, vast natural resources, and some of the fastest-growing cities on Earth. The question is whether these strengths will be connected or deliberately kept fragmented. History teaches us that divided nations are easier to exploit than united ones. Division weakens bargaining power, limits markets, fuels conflict, and allows wealth to flow outward. Unity creates scale, resilience, innovation, and shared prosperity. So as we begin this investigation, keep one question in mind. If Africans truly began seeing one another as partners rather than competitors, who would gain? And perhaps more importantly, who would lose? Because understanding the answer to that question may explain much of Africa's past and shape its future. Before we continue, it is important to understand the mission behind Griot Wave Academy. This platform was created to preserve knowledge, culture, music, and stories that often go unheard or are forgotten. Griot Wave is not just about content. It is about building independent systems of learning, creativity, and empowerment. Through books, audio, technology, and media, the goal is to transform timeless wisdom into practical tools for today's generation and future generations. This slide is more than a recap. It is a map. Every episode in this series builds on the last because Africa's challenges are interconnected. If we only examine one symptom, we miss the system that produces it. We began with a simple question. What happened to the dream of Pan-African unity? From there, we examined why migrant-owned businesses become targets during economic hardship, and why the evidence shows migrants often complement local economies rather than replace them. Next, we followed the incentives. Who benefits when Africans fight Africans? Which industries, political actors, and economic interests gain from a divided continent? We then identified the often invisible winners of Africa's fragmentation, and showed how division is not merely historical. It continues to generate enormous economic and political rewards for those who profit from extraction. The series then shifted to politics. We investigated how xenophobia can become a convenient distraction from governance failures, corruption, and unemployment. We asked whether apartheid's strategy of divide and rule truly ended, or whether the lines of division simply shifted from race to nationality. Finally, we tested one of the most common claims. What if every African migrant left South Africa tomorrow? The evidence showed that the structural crises, electricity, corruption, housing, unemployment, and failing municipalities, would remain largely unchanged. The diagnosis was wrong because the problem was never primarily the migrant. Now we take the final step. Having exposed the myths, identified the incentives, and followed the evidence, we asked the biggest question of all. What does Africa lose by remaining divided? And what becomes possible if it finally chooses unity? That is where this final investigation begins. This is where the series turns from diagnosis to design. For 8 episodes, we have investigated Africa's divisions. We have followed the evidence, challenged popular narratives, exposed structural failures, and asked who benefits when Africans are separated by borders, fear, and mistrust. Now we ask a different question. What would it actually take to build the Africa envisioned by Pan-African thinkers? These 5 pillars provide that framework. We begin with the mathematics of unity. Beyond the ideals and slogans, what is a united Africa worth in measurable economic terms? How much growth, trade, investment, and prosperity is lost because the continent remains fragmented? Next, we examine the African Continental Free Trade Area, potentially the most important economic project in modern African history. Is it simply another agreement, or the foundation of a truly integrated continental economy? Third, we explore free movement. Throughout history, prosperity has followed the movement of people, ideas, and capital. What would change if Africans could travel, work, study, and build businesses across the continent with far fewer barriers? The fourth pillar asks the uncomfortable question. Who fears African unity? Every major transformation creates winners and losers. We will identify the political, economic, and geopolitical interests that benefit from Africa remaining divided, and why. Finally, we end with a practical blueprint. Unity cannot depend only on governments. Citizens, entrepreneurs, educators, investors, creators, and the African diaspora all have a role in building the continent from the ground up. This is not a discussion about what Africa lacks. It is an exploration of what Africa already possesses, and what becomes possible when those strengths are connected instead of divided. The investigation now shifts from exposing problems to building solutions. This chapter moves us from emotion to economics. When people hear the phrase African unity, they often think of politics, flags, or idealism. But history shows that the nations which became global powers did not rise because they were divided. They rose because they built large, integrated markets. The United States united 50 states into one economy. Europe, after centuries of war, created a single market. China transformed itself by integrating a vast internal market. Scale creates power. So the question we ask is simple. What is the economic cost of Africa remaining divided? Every visa barrier, customs delay, incompatible regulation, and closed border carries a price. Every African country negotiating alone weakens its bargaining power. Every time African businesses must trade through Europe or Asia instead of directly with each other, wealth leaks out of the continent. This chapter is not about dreams. It is about mathematics. We will examine Africa's combined GDP, its 1.4 billion consumers, its vast reserves of critical minerals, its agricultural potential, its youthful workforce, and the purchasing power that already exists, but remains fragmented across 54 separate markets. We will also ask a more uncomfortable question. If the numbers show that a united Africa would become one of the world's largest economic powers, why has continental integration progressed so slowly? Who benefits from keeping Africa divided into dozens of smaller, weaker negotiating units? By the end of this chapter, the conversation about African unity should change forever. It is not simply a moral or cultural aspiration. It is one of the largest economic opportunities of the 21st century. The mathematics are straightforward. The real question is whether the political will exists to unlock them. This slide is the foundation of the entire argument. Before we ask whether Africa should unite, we must first understand what Africa actually is. Not as it is often portrayed, but as it exists on the global balance sheet. Consider the numbers. Today, Africa's combined economy is worth approximately $3.4 trillion. If the continent sustains current growth and deepens integration, projections place that figure near $29 trillion by 2050 making Africa one of the world's largest economic blocs. Africa is home to 1.4 billion people, rising to around 2.5 billion by the end of the century's first half. That means the world's largest workforce, its fastest growing consumer market, and an unparalleled demographic advantage at a time when many developed nations face aging populations. Then there are the resources. Africa holds around 30% of the world's critical mineral reserves the cobalt, platinum, manganese, rare earths, and other materials needed for electric vehicles, renewable energy, batteries, and advanced technology. It also possesses roughly 70% of the world's uncultivated arable land, making the continent central to future global food security. Yet despite these extraordinary strengths, Africa loses an estimated $180 billion every year, through conflict, instability, and fragmentation. That is wealth that could finance infrastructure, education, healthcare, and industrialization, but is instead consumed by division. The message is simple. Africa is not poor. It is fragmented. The continent already possesses the people, the resources, the land, and the economic potential to become a global powerhouse. The question is no longer whether Africa has enough. The question is whether Africans can organize these immense assets into a single, coordinated economic force. Because if they can, the balance of global economic power will inevitably begin to shift. Here we answers the question that critics often ask. What does African unity actually deliver? The answer is measurable economic gains, not in theory, but through policies already used successfully in other regions. Look first at trade. Today, only about 15% of Africa's exports stay within Africa. In Europe, that figure exceeds 60%. With full implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area and improved transport links, intra-African trade could rise to more than 50%, keeping far more wealth circulating within the continent instead of exporting raw materials and importing finished products. Next, consider natural resources. Africa supplies many of the minerals powering the global economy, yet often earns only a small fraction of their value. Acting together, African nations could negotiate higher royalties and fairer contracts, generating an estimated $35 to $55 billion in additional annual public revenue, money that could fund schools, hospitals, infrastructure, and industrialization. Unity also strengthens financial power. A larger, integrated market presents lower investment risk, reducing borrowing costs and potentially saving around $40 billion in debt servicing over time. Families would also benefit from cheaper remittance systems, keeping billions more dollars in African households instead of paying excessive transfer fees. Perhaps the most transformative gain is agricultural value. Africa exports too many raw commodities and imports expensive processed food. A continental market encourages processing, manufacturing, and regional supply chains, allowing African countries to export finished products instead of raw materials. The message is simple: unity is not charity. It is economics. Every barrier removed, every border simplified, and every coordinated negotiation increases the value Africa captures from its own people, resources, and markets. The real dividend of unity is not simply a larger economy. It is an Africa that retains more of the wealth it already creates and uses that wealth to build its own future. Here we asks us to think beyond Africa's internal economy and consider its position in the global system. Power in international politics is rarely determined by who is right. It is determined by who has leverage. Fragmentation weakens leverage. Unity multiplies it. Today, Africa often negotiates as * 54 separate countries, each with different priorities, different capacities, and vastly different bargaining power. Large economies and multinational corporations can negotiate with individual states one by one, often securing terms they could never achieve if Africa acted collectively. Imagine instead that Africa negotiated as a single economic bloc. At the * World Trade Organization, a united African position would represent over * 1.4 billion people, one of the world's largest markets, and a combined economy worth trillions of dollars. Trade agreements would no longer be negotiated country by country, but continent to continent. The same principle applies to the * IMF and World Bank. A coordinated African position would strengthen the continent's ability to negotiate lending terms, debt restructuring, and development priorities from a position of collective influence rather than individual dependence. Resource negotiations would also change fundamentally. Africa produces many of the critical minerals essential to the global energy transition. When countries negotiate separately, buyers can play one government against another. A coordinated continental approach could establish minimum royalty standards, fair pricing, and greater local value addition. Finally, climate finance. Africa contributes the least to global emissions, yet bears some of the greatest climate risks. Speaking with one voice would strengthen the continent's ability to demand equitable climate finance, technology transfer, and investment. The lesson is simple. Unity does not eliminate national sovereignty. It strengthens it. When nations cooperate on issues of common interest, each country gains more influence than it could ever achieve alone. Africa's greatest untapped resource may not be its minerals or its land. It may be its collective negotiating power. This chapter moves us from possibility to implementation. If African unity is the vision, then the * African Continental Free Trade Area * or * AfCFTA (NUCL) is the vehicle designed to make that vision real. It is not simply another trade agreement. It is the largest free trade area in the world by the number of participating countries, bringing together 54 nations, over 1.4 billion people, and a combined economy worth more than $3 trillion. For decades, Africa has exported raw materials to the rest of the world while importing finished products at much higher prices. Cotton leaves Africa and returns as clothing. Cocoa leaves Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, but chocolate profits are made elsewhere. Lithium leaves Africa, while batteries and electric vehicles are manufactured overseas. AfCFTA offers an opportunity to change that pattern. The agreement aims to remove tariffs, reduce border delays, harmonize regulations, and make it easier for African businesses to trade with one another. Instead of treating neighboring countries as foreign markets, it encourages the creation of one continental marketplace where businesses can scale, manufacturers can build regional supply chains, and entrepreneurs can access hundreds of millions of new customers. But signing an agreement is only the beginning. The real challenge is implementation. Roads, railways, ports, digital payment systems, customs modernization, industrial policy, and political cooperation must all work together. Without these, free trade remains a promise rather than a reality. Throughout this chapter, we will examine what AfCFTA has already achieved, the obstacles still holding it back, and the extraordinary economic transformation it could unlock if fully implemented. Because the question is no longer whether Africa should trade more with itself. The question is how quickly it can build the institutions, infrastructure, and political trust needed to turn a historic agreement into a continental economic revolution. This slide shows why many economists describe AfCFTA as the most significant economic project in modern African history. It is not simply about lowering tariffs. It is about transforming 54 fragmented markets into one integrated continental economy. Consider the scale. AfCFTA brings together **54 member states, creating a market of **1.4 billion people with a combined GDP of approximately $3.4 trillion. If treated as a single economy, Africa would rank among the largest economic blocs in the world. Few regions have ever attempted integration on this scale. The agreement's ambition is equally significant. Around *90% of tariffs on goods traded within Africa are scheduled to be eliminated over time. Lower trade barriers mean lower costs for businesses, faster movement of goods, and stronger regional supply chains. Instead of importing products from outside the continent, African manufacturers can increasingly source inputs from neighboring countries. The target is transformative. Today, only about *15% of African exports remain within Africa. AfCFTA aims to increase that figure to around *52% by 2035 bringing Africa closer to the levels of regional trade seen in Europe and Southeast Asia. Every additional percentage point means more factories, more logistics companies, more jobs, and more value created inside Africa. The economic prize is enormous. The UN Economic Commission for Africa estimates that full implementation could generate around $450 billion in additional annual trade. That is not money created from nowhere. It is wealth currently lost through fragmented markets, duplicated regulations, border delays, and unnecessary dependence on external trade routes. The key message is this: AfCFTA is not merely a trade agreement, it is an industrialization strategy. It provides African businesses with the scale needed to compete globally, encourages manufacturing instead of raw material exports, and lays the foundation for long-term economic sovereignty. The architecture has been built. The challenge now is ensuring every nation helps complete the structure. This slide demonstrates that AfCFTA is far more than a tariff agreement. It is a blueprint for restructuring Africa's entire economy. The real transformation comes not from removing taxes at the border, but from creating a continent where businesses can produce, invest, and innovate at scale. Take manufacturing. Today, many African countries have domestic markets that are too small to support globally competitive industries. A factory in Kenya, Ghana, or Zambia often cannot achieve the production volumes needed to reduce costs. A single continental market changes that. Manufacturers can produce for over 1.4 billion consumers, encouraging investment in automobiles, pharmaceuticals, electronics, and consumer goods. Africa moves from exporting raw materials to producing finished products. The same principle applies to agriculture. Africa possesses most of the world's uncultivated arable land, yet imports billions of dollars of food every year. Integrated markets allow food to move efficiently across borders, reduce post-harvest losses, strengthen regional food security, and create agro-processing industries that keep more value within Africa. Financial services would also be transformed. Instead of fragmented banking and payment systems, harmonized regulations and continental digital payments would make it easier for entrepreneurs to raise capital, expand across borders, and build African multinational companies. Energy is another opportunity. Africa has immense renewable energy potential, but electricity networks remain largely national. Greater regional integration means countries can share power, reduce shortages, lower costs, and support industrial growth across borders. The central lesson is this: now for scale changes everything. No single African country can fully unlock these opportunities alone. But together, they can create an integrated economy capable of competing with the world's largest markets. AfCFTA is not simply about trading more. It is about building an Africa that manufactures more, feeds itself, finances its own growth, and powers its own future. This slide reminds us that signing an agreement is the easy part. Implementing it is where history is made. AfCFTA is already law. The vision has been endorsed by governments across the continent. But there is a crucial difference between legal integration and economic integration. The gap between those two realities is where Africa's next decade will be decided. The first challenge is infrastructure. African businesses still face some of the highest transport costs in the world because roads, railways, ports, and logistics networks were largely built to move raw materials out of Africa, not to connect African economies to one another. Closing this infrastructure gap is essential if trade is to become faster and cheaper. The second challenge is bureaucracy. Rules of origin, customs procedures, and technical standards are necessary, but when they become overly complex, they create barriers that smaller African businesses struggle to overcome. Integration must make trade easier, not replace tariffs with paperwork. Third are non-tariff barriers. Border delays, inconsistent regulations, informal payments, and duplicated inspections often cost businesses more than tariffs ever did. Eliminating these hidden costs could unlock billions in additional trade. Finally, financial inclusion. Millions of African entrepreneurs still operate largely in cash and lack access to affordable banking or cross-border payment systems. Continental trade cannot flourish if businesses cannot move money efficiently across borders. Digital payment platforms and interoperable financial systems are just as important as roads and ports. The encouraging news is that none of these problems are unsolvable. The solutions already exist through initiatives such as PETA, the AfCFTA payment and settlement system, harmonized standards and transport agreements. What is required now is sustained political commitment, investment, and coordination. The lesson is simple. NIM's AfCFTA is no longer waiting for signatures. It is waiting for execution. NAPS. Africa has written the blueprint. The next challenge is building it. This chapter explores one of the most transformative and most debated ideas in the Pan-African project, the free movement of African people. Throughout history, the world's most successful economies have combined free trade with the free movement of labor, skills, ideas, and investment. Goods move more efficiently when people can move with them. Businesses grow faster when talent can cross borders. Innovation accelerates when students, researchers, and entrepreneurs collaborate without unnecessary barriers. Yet Africa remains one of the most difficult continents for Africans to travel within. In many cases, it is easier to fly to Europe than to a neighboring African country. Visa requirements, expensive air travel, fragmented regulations, and administrative barriers continue to divide a continent whose people share deep historical, cultural, and economic ties. The question is not whether borders should exist. Every sovereign nation has the right to manage its borders and protect its security. The real question is whether Africa's current system serves African development or unintentionally limits it. What would change if an engineer from Ghana could work easily in Kenya? If a Nigerian entrepreneur could establish a business in Zambia without excessive bureaucracy? If South African students could study in Senegal as easily as Europeans study across the European Union? What if African professionals, investors, and innovators viewed the entire continent as their home market? Of course, free movement must be managed responsibly, with shared security systems, coordinated immigration policies, and fair labor protections. But these are implementation challenges, not reasons to abandon the vision. In this chapter, we examine the evidence from other regions, the African Union's Continental Passport Initiative, and the economic, cultural, and strategic benefits of allowing Africans to move more freely across their own continent. Because true continental integration is not achieved simply by moving goods. It is achieved by connecting people. And history shows that when people connect, prosperity follows. This slide highlights one of the greatest contradictions facing Africa today. We speak of African unity, continental integration, and a shared future, yet for many Africans, traveling to another African country remains harder than traveling to Europe, Asia, or North America. Think about that for a moment. A continent that seeks economic integration still places barriers in front of its own people. Every visa application, every unnecessary delay, and every bureaucratic obstacle sends a message that fellow Africans are foreigners before they are partners. The economic cost is enormous. Studies estimate that visa restrictions suppress intra-African tourism and business travel by tens of billions of dollars each year. Every canceled business trip is a missed investment. Every student who cannot easily study across borders is lost human capital. Every entrepreneur prevented from entering a new market is a missed opportunity for jobs and innovation. Yet the evidence also shows another path. Countries such as Benin, Rwanda, and Seychelles have demonstrated that more open visa policies are possible. They have shown that welcoming fellow Africans can increase tourism, investment, and regional cooperation, while maintaining national security through modern immigration systems. Free movement does not mean open borders without rules. It means smart borders, shared databases, coordinated security, digital visas where needed, and trusted systems that allow legitimate travelers, workers, students, and investors to move efficiently while protecting against crime and trafficking. The real question is not whether Africa can trust itself. It is whether Africa can afford *2. Every successful common market, from the European Union to the United States, understands that people, ideas, and businesses must move if economies are to grow. Africa's greatest resource is not only its minerals or its land. It is its people. Keeping them divided by unnecessary barriers limits the very integration the continent is trying to build. A united Africa begins not only with free trade, but with Africans being free to meet, build, and prosper together. This slide shifts the discussion from removing barriers to creating opportunities. Free movement is often debated in terms of immigration, but its greatest impact is economic. When people, skills, and ideas can move more easily, entire economies become more productive. First, consider the labor market. Africa has shortages of engineers, doctors, teachers, technicians, and skilled workers in some regions. while other countries have talented professionals seeking opportunities. Free movement helps match skills with demand, allowing African expertise to solve African challenges instead of being lost through migration outside the continent. Productivity rises because talent goes where it is needed most. Second, market expansion. For many entrepreneurs, the domestic market is simply too small. Free movement allows businesses to think continentally rather than nationally. A startup in Lagos, Kigali, or Nairobi is no longer limited to one country. It gains access to over 1 billion potential customers. That scale attracts investment, encourages innovation, and supports industries that individual national markets cannot sustain. Third, innovation. History shows that breakthroughs happen when people collaborate. Silicon Valley, Shenzhen, and Bangalore all grew because talent flowed freely. Imagine a connected African innovation network where researchers, universities, engineers, and entrepreneurs move easily between Accra, Cape Town, Nairobi, Cairo, and Lagos. Knowledge spreads faster than borders can contain it. Finally, there is a benefit that cannot easily be measured on a balance sheet: trust. People rarely fear those they know. When Africans travel, study, work, and build businesses together, stereotypes begin to disappear. Relationships replace suspicion. Trade becomes stronger because trust becomes stronger. This is the deeper promise of free movement. It is not simply about crossing borders more easily. It is about building a continent where opportunity follows talent, ideas move without unnecessary obstacles, and Africans increasingly see one another not as strangers, but as partners in a shared future. If you are serious about Africa's future, you must also become serious about personal growth, execution, discipline, entrepreneurship, and building. Knowledge without implementation changes nothing. That is exactly why I'm building the Griot Wave Inner Circle, an execution-focused community for builders, creators, entrepreneurs, and purpose-driven individuals. A space focused on accountability, implementation, entrepreneurship, transformation, AI and digital leverage, community, and real progress. Weekly live sessions, execution systems, focused builders, real conversations, real growth. If you are tired of consuming endlessly and ready to start building intentionally, scan the QR code or use the link below to join the early interest list. Stop consuming, start building. Don't build alone. Join the Griot Wave Inner Circle and connect with a community focused on real execution and transformation. Scan the QR code to begin. This slide reminds us that Pan-Africanism cannot remain a slogan. It must become a system. For decades, African leaders have spoken about unity, integration, and a shared destiny. The African Union Passport is the practical mechanism designed to make those aspirations real. It is not simply a travel document. It is the foundation of continental citizenship. As former AU Commission Chair Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma argued, a passport is infrastructure. It allows students to study across borders, entrepreneurs to open businesses, professionals to fill skills shortages, and families to reconnect across artificial colonial boundaries. Without freedom of movement, a continental market can never operate at its full potential. The timeline tells an important story. In 2016, the African Union launched the passport concept with enormous optimism. In 2018, the Free Movement of Persons Protocol was signed alongside AfCFTA, recognizing that free trade and free movement must advance together. Goods cannot move efficiently if the people who produce, transport, and sell them remain trapped behind visa barriers. Yet progress has been slow. Ratification has lagged because of concerns over security, irregular migration, political resistance, and limited implementation capacity. These concerns are legitimate, but they are not unique to Africa. Other regions have shown that stronger border management and greater mobility can coexist. The next phase is therefore not about abandoning the vision, but building the systems that make it work. Biometric passports, interoperable border technology, shared security databases, coordinated immigration policies, and affordable continental air travel. These are practical governance challenges, not reasons to reject integration. The key message is simple. NIMS times AfCFTA connects African markets. The African passport connects African people. One without the other leaves the project incomplete. If the 21st century is to become Africa's century, the continent must make it as easy for Africans to build together as it currently is to remain divided apart. This chapter asks an uncomfortable but necessary question. If the economic, political, and cultural benefits of African unity are so substantial, why has progress been so slow? The answer may be that fragmentation is not merely a problem, it is profitable. Throughout history, major systems of power have often depended on keeping people divided. Colonial administrations governed through borders, ethnic classifications, and competing local interests. Those formal empires ended, but many of the incentives created by fragmentation did not. This chapter is not about conspiracy theories or hidden puppet masters. It is about incentives. In politics, business, and international relations, we should always ask one simple question. Who benefits from the current arrangement? When Africa negotiates as 54 separate economies, buyers gain leverage. When mineral-rich countries compete against one another, commodity prices and royalty rates can be driven down. When trade flows outward rather than across the continent, external industries capture more of the value. When Africans distrust one another, regional cooperation weakens, and domestic leaders can more easily redirect public frustration toward convenient scapegoats. But this is not only about external interests. Some African political and business elites also benefit from fragmentation. Closed markets can protect monopolies. Weak regional competition can preserve local privilege. Divisions based on nationality, ethnicity, or language can become powerful political tools. Recognizing these incentives does not mean assuming every disagreement is malicious. Nations have legitimate security concerns, economic priorities, and political differences. But it does mean understanding that meaningful change almost always challenges established interests. As we move through this chapter, we will identify the structures, institutions, and incentives that gain from a divided Africa, not to assign blame, but to understand why continental integration has faced persistent resistance. Because history teaches an important lesson. Whenever unity has the potential to redistribute power, those who benefit from the existing order rarely surrender their advantages willingly. Understanding that reality is the first step toward changing it. This chapter asks perhaps the most uncomfortable question of the series. If African unity would create greater prosperity for the continent, who stands to lose? History teaches us that every major redistribution of power creates resistance. Those who benefit most from the existing system rarely support changes that reduce their advantage. This is not about assigning blame to entire nations or institutions. It is about understanding incentives. Consider extractive industries. For decades, African countries have often negotiated mineral contracts individually. That fragmentation gives multinational corporations greater bargaining power. A continent negotiating collectively on royalty standards, local processing, and value addition would fundamentally change those negotiations. The same principle applies to trade and finance. Agricultural subsidies in wealthy economies make it difficult for African farmers to compete. Bilateral aid and lending relationships often allow external institutions to negotiate with governments one by one. A more integrated Africa, with stronger regional financing, larger internal markets, and coordinated positions, would have greater leverage and more policy independence. Security is another example. Conflict fragments markets, discourages investment, and creates demand for imported arms and security services. Peace, regional cooperation, and stronger institutions reduce those opportunities while increasing long-term prosperity. But we must also look inward. Fragmentation can benefit domestic, political, and economic elites. Corruption, monopolies, weak procurement systems, and patronage networks often thrive where accountability is limited and countries act in isolation. Stronger continental cooperation on anti-corruption, taxation, and financial transparency would make illicit enrichment more difficult. The purpose of this chapter is not to suggest that every external partner or every business opposes African development. Many contribute positively to Africa's growth. Rather, it is to recognize a simple economic truth. When the rules of the game change, some interests gain and others lose. Understanding who benefits from division helps explain why the path to unity has been so challenging. It also reminds us that the greatest obstacles to African integration are not technical, they are political and economic. Whenever Africa becomes more united, more self-reliant, and more capable of negotiating as one, the balance of power inevitably begins to shift. This slide explores how opposition to African integration is expressed through institutions and policy, rather than suggesting that there is a single coordinated actor or conspiracy. Throughout history, powerful interests, both domestic and international, have often preferred arrangements that preserve existing advantages. The question is how those incentives shape outcomes. The first mechanism is bilateral negotiation. When African countries negotiate separately, they have less bargaining power than they would as a continental bloc. Whether discussing trade agreements, mineral contracts, or market access, fragmentation allows stronger negotiating partners to pursue country-by-country deals instead of engaging with Africa as a unified market. Second is security dependence. Many African states rely on external military partnerships, training, and security assistance. These relationships can provide real benefits, but they may also influence foreign policy choices and reduce strategic autonomy when national priorities conflict with those of key partners. Third is policy influence through finance and technical advice. International financial institutions, development agencies, and global consultancies have played significant roles in shaping economic policy across Africa. Their advice has often promoted market liberalization and fiscal discipline. Supporters argue these reforms improve stability. Critics contend they can limit governments' room to pursue alternative development strategies. Finally, there is the asterisk information environment. International media, research institutions, and policy networks help shape global narratives about Africa. The stories that receive attention can influence investment decisions, public opinion, and political priorities, while African perspectives often receive less global visibility. The central point is not that cooperation with external partners is undesirable. Africa benefits from trade, investment, and international partnerships. The question is whether those relationships are negotiated from a position of fragmentation or collective strength. A more integrated Africa would not end international cooperation, it would reshape it. The difference is that a continent negotiating together has greater leverage to define its own priorities, protect its interests, and ensure that partnership is based on mutual benefit, rather than unequal bargaining power. This presentation has examined the economics of African unity. This slide reminds us that these ideas have also been profoundly political. Throughout modern African history, leaders who challenged existing international economic structures often faced intense resistance. The reasons differed, the contexts differed, and historians continue to debate many aspects of these events. But together, they raise an important question. What happens when leaders pursue a more economically independent path? Kwame Nkrumah argued that political independence without economic unity would leave Africa vulnerable to external influence. He championed continental integration long before it became fashionable. His government was overthrown in 1966, and while the causes remain debated, the event became a defining moment in Pan-African history. Thomas Sankara pursued self-reliance, challenged debt dependency, and called for African economic cooperation. His assassination in 1987 ended one of the continent's most ambitious reform programs after only 4 years, leaving many of his ideas unfinished. Muammar Gaddafi promoted proposals for stronger African financial institutions, greater continental investment, and, at times, a common currency. His 2011 overthrow and death remain deeply contested internationally, but they also ended one of the strongest state-backed campaigns for African economic integration. Paul Kagame represents a different example. Rather than confrontation alone, Rwanda has focused on building domestic institutions, while actively supporting initiatives such as the African Continental Free Trade Area and greater regional integration. His experience suggests that sustained state capacity can provide resilience in pursuing long-term continental goals. The lesson is not that every leader was beyond criticism, or that every policy was correct. It is that transformative ideas often encounter powerful opposition. Understanding African unity therefore requires studying both the visionaries who promoted it and the political realities they confronted. The future of integration will depend not only on good ideas, but on the institutions, leadership, and public support capable of sustaining them. This final chapter is where analysis becomes action. Throughout this series, we have examined the economics of African fragmentation, the costs of division, the opportunities created by continental integration, and the interests that often resist it. The natural question is, what comes next? The answer is that African unity cannot be built by governments alone. It requires participation from citizens, entrepreneurs, educators, researchers, civil society, the private sector, and the African diaspora. Every generation inherits a vision, but it is judged by what it builds. This chapter is not about abstract ideals. It is about practical steps that can begin today. We will explore what businesses can do to trade across borders, what universities can do to strengthen continental knowledge networks, what young Africans can do to prepare for a more integrated labor market, and what policymakers can do to accelerate implementation of agreements that already exist. We will also examine the role of technology, digital payments, infrastructure, media, education, and culture in making African unity tangible rather than symbolic. Because treaties alone do not unite people, shared opportunities do. Perhaps most importantly, we will ask what role the diaspora can play. Africans abroad possess capital, expertise, networks, and influence that can help accelerate the continent's development if connected to long-term continental priorities. The message of this chapter is simple. Unity is not an event waiting to happen. It is a project that must be built deliberately. One institution, one business partnership, one policy reform, and one relationship at a time. History shows that every great transformation begins when ordinary people decide that the future does not have to resemble the past. The blueprint already exists. The question is whether this generation has the courage, discipline, and imagination to build it. This presentation has explored ambitious long-term goals, but meaningful progress does not always require new treaties or constitutional change. Some of the most important advances are already within reach. The legal frameworks exist. The institutions exist. In many cases, what is missing is implementation. The first opportunity is enforcing existing regional free movement agreements. Millions of Africans already live in regions where free movement has been signed into law, yet inconsistent border practices and administrative barriers prevent citizens from enjoying those rights. Simply implementing existing commitments would immediately improve trade, labor mobility, and regional integration. Second is expanding the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System, or PAPSS. Today, many African businesses must route payments through foreign currencies, adding unnecessary cost and delay. A continent-wide payment network would allow businesses to trade directly in African currencies, reducing transaction costs and making cross-border commerce more accessible, particularly for small and medium-sized enterprises. Third is implementing the single African air transport market. Africa remains one of the world's most expensive regions to fly within, because national aviation markets are fragmented. Opening African skies would increase competition, reduce fares, improve connectivity, and make business, tourism, and cultural exchange significantly easier. Finally, digitizing AfCFTA certificates of origin would remove one of the biggest practical barriers facing smaller businesses. Large corporations can navigate complex paperwork, small entrepreneurs often cannot. Digital systems would make preferential trade accessible to thousands of African businesses, currently excluded by bureaucracy. The common theme is simple. None of these initiatives require reinventing the African Union or negotiating entirely new agreements. They require governments to implement commitments they have already made. The lesson is encouraging. Continental integration is not a distant dream waiting for future generations. Significant progress can begin today through practical reforms that are achievable, measurable, and already supported by existing African institutions. This slide focuses on the next decade, the period when Africa can move from signing agreements to implementing them. The vision has already been outlined. The institutions largely exist. What is needed now is coordinated execution. The first priority is completing AfCFTA tariff implementation. Reducing tariffs across member states will make it easier for African businesses to trade with one another, strengthen regional value chains, and encourage industrial production within the continent, rather than exporting raw materials. Second is building continental transport infrastructure. Rail corridors linking ports, manufacturing centers, and landlocked countries can dramatically reduce transport costs, improve food security, and make African industries more competitive in global markets. Third is bringing the Free Movement Protocol into force through additional ratifications. A continental labor market allows skills, entrepreneurs, and investment to move where they are most needed, increasing productivity and creating opportunities for millions of Africans. Fourth is establishing an African credit rating agency. Many African governments argue that international credit assessments overestimate investment risk, increasing borrowing costs. A credible African institution could provide additional analysis and strengthen the continent's financial independence while maintaining international standards. Fifth, Africa can negotiate collectively on mineral royalties. Instead of countries competing against one another to offer the lowest terms, coordinated minimum standards would strengthen bargaining power and ensure a greater share of mineral wealth remains on the continent. Finally, an interconnected continental energy grid would unlock one of Africa's greatest advantages: abundant renewable energy. Linking regional power pools would improve electricity reliability, support industrialization, and expand access to affordable power. Together, these 6 priorities form a practical agenda for 2025 to 2035. None represents a distant dream. Each builds on agreements, institutions, and regional initiatives that already exist. The challenge is no longer deciding what Africa should do. The challenge is finding the political commitment to implement what has already been agreed. This presentation has focused largely on governments, institutions, and public policy. But continental integration is not driven by governments alone. In many ways, Africa's private sector is already building the future that political systems are still catching up to. Consider Ethiopian Airlines. It has created one of the continent's most connected aviation networks, linking dozens of African cities and making business, tourism, and trade possible across borders. It demonstrates that African-scale infrastructure is commercially viable when there is long-term strategic vision. Dangote Group offers another example. By investing across multiple African countries, it has shown that manufacturing at continental scale can reduce imports, strengthen regional supply chains, and create value that remains within Africa. It illustrates the economic potential of African-owned industrial champions. Mountain has quietly built one of the continent's largest digital networks, connecting hundreds of millions of people across numerous countries. Its expansion shows that Africans are already living in an increasingly integrated digital economy. Yet regulatory differences between countries still slow innovation and increase costs. Equity Group demonstrates what continental financial integration can look like. Operating across East Africa, it has pioneered cross-border banking and digital financial services that make it easier for businesses and individuals to transact across national boundaries. The common lesson is clear. African businesses are proving that continental integration works in practice. They are creating networks that ignore colonial-era divisions and treat Africa as a single market. The challenge is that policy has not kept pace with enterprise. Governments often regulate nationally, while businesses increasingly operate regionally. If Africa wants to accelerate integration, the private sector should be seen not simply as a stakeholder, but as a strategic partner. The entrepreneurs building continental value chains today are providing a blueprint for the Africa that tomorrow's policies should support. In many respects, business is already showing policymakers what African unity can look like in practice. This final slide focuses on one of Africa's greatest strategic assets, its diaspora. The African Union officially recognizes the diaspora as the continent's sixth region, not simply because of its size, but because of its influence. Millions of Africans living abroad contribute through remittances, professional expertise, research, entrepreneurship, and public service. The question is not whether the diaspora matters. It is how that influence can be directed toward Africa's long-term development. Financially, the diaspora already plays an enormous role. Annual remittances support families and local economies across the continent. But beyond consumption, there is also an opportunity to expand investment in African infrastructure, businesses, technology, and innovation through well-governed investment vehicles and capital markets. The intellectual diaspora is equally important. African scholars, scientists, engineers, and professionals work in many of the world's leading universities, laboratories, and institutions. Their knowledge, research, and networks can strengthen African universities, public policy, and innovation ecosystems through collaboration rather than permanent separation. The political diaspora has another responsibility. Many Africans are citizens of countries whose governments, corporations, and financial institutions continue to shape Africa's economic environment. Democratic participation, informed advocacy, and constructive engagement can help ensure African perspectives are better represented in international policymaking. Finally, there is the media diaspora. Stories shape public opinion, investment decisions, and international relationships. African journalists, filmmakers, writers, educators, and digital creators have an opportunity to tell more complete, evidence-based stories about the continent, challenging stereotypes while showcasing innovation, entrepreneurship, and opportunity. The central message is simple. The diaspora is not outside Africa's future. It is part of it. Whether through capital, knowledge, influence, or storytelling, Africans everywhere have a role in building a more integrated, prosperous, and confident continent. African unity is not only a project for those living on the continent. It is a shared responsibility for Africans wherever they call home. This presentation has explored what African unity could achieve in the future. This slide asks an important question. Has any of it ever worked in practice? The answer is yes. Across the continent, there are already examples showing that integration delivers measurable economic and social benefits. In East Africa, the East African community has demonstrated how reducing barriers can increase regional trade, encourage investment, and improve labor mobility. Businesses increasingly see the region as one market, rather than several isolated economies, while cities like Nairobi and Kigali have become important regional innovation and commercial hubs. In West Africa, ECOWAS has operated a free movement protocol for decades. Citizens can travel, live, and work across member states with relatively few restrictions. This has supported vibrant regional trade networks, strengthened entrepreneurship, and created one of Africa's most integrated economic corridors. Rwanda provides another practical example. Its visa-on-arrival policy for all African nationals has expanded tourism, increased international conferences, attracted investment, and strengthened its position as a gateway for business on the continent. Openness has proven to be an economic strategy, not simply a diplomatic gesture. Southern Africa offers a different example through the Southern African Power Pool. By connecting national electricity grids, countries can share surplus energy, improve reliability, and reduce the costs of maintaining separate systems. Regional cooperation has strengthened energy security without requiring political union. The common lesson is straightforward. African integration is not an untested theory. It has already produced measurable results wherever it has been implemented, with commitment and consistency. These examples are also important because they reduce the perceived risk of deeper integration. Africa does not need to copy another continent's model blindly. It already has successful African case studies to learn from and expand. The challenge before the continent is not whether unity can work. The evidence suggests that it can. The real challenge is scaling successful regional initiatives into a truly continental system, allowing the benefits already seen in parts of Africa to become available to all Africans. This presentation began with a question. Why is Africa so divided? It ends with a different question. What can each of us do about it? The future of African unity will not be decided only in presidential summits or African Union meetings. It will also be shaped by millions of individual choices made every day. The first step is to learn. Understanding Africa's history, institutions, and opportunities allows us to challenge misinformation with evidence rather than emotion. Knowledge is the foundation of meaningful action. The second is to experience Africa directly. Travel, where possible, broadens perspectives, builds relationships, and reminds us that the continent is far more connected than political borders often suggest. Third, support African businesses. Every purchasing decision is also an investment decision. Choosing African products, services, and entrepreneurs helps build industries, create jobs, and strengthen regional value chains. Build relationships across borders. Friendships, professional networks, and cultural exchanges create trust, the most valuable currency of integration. People rarely fear those they know. Where possible, invest in Africa. Whether through businesses, capital markets, or community initiatives, long-term investment helps create the productive economy that the continent needs. Engage in civic life. Support evidence-based policies. Question narratives that divide Africans, and hold leaders accountable for implementing agreements they have already signed. If you create content, tell African stories with accuracy, confidence, and depth. If you teach, pass this knowledge to the next generation. If you have influence, use it to encourage cooperation rather than division. The central message is simple. Pan-Africanism is not just an ideology. It is a daily practice. Every informed conversation, every cross-border partnership, every business transaction, every investment, and every act of solidarity contributes to the Africa we want to build. History is shaped not only by extraordinary leaders, but by ordinary citizens making extraordinary choices consistently. The future of African unity begins with what each of us chooses to do today. This is the reading list that underpins the entire series. Amilcar Cabral is underrepresented in most Pan-African reading lists. His concept of national culture as a weapon of liberation, that a people who understand and take pride in their own cultural heritage cannot be permanently colonized, is the intellectual basis for Griot Wave Academy's approach. We are doing what Cabral described, restoring knowledge as liberation technology. Carlos Lopez and Vera Songwe represent the newest generation of Pan-African economists who are building the AfCFTA framework from inside African institutions. Their work is technical, contemporary, and essential for understanding the current implementation challenge. These are the shoulders you are standing on. Every idea in this series was built on their foundations. When you share these videos, you are extending their project. When you act on these ideas, you are living their vision. This presentation has explored Africa's past, its present challenges, and the practical steps that can move the continent toward greater unity. This final slide asks us to imagine the destination, not as fantasy, but as a scenario built from demographic trends, economic projections, and the successful implementation of policies already under discussion. By 2050, Africa is expected to be home to around 2.5 billion people, making it the world's largest workforce and one of its largest consumer markets. If that population is connected through integrated markets, efficient infrastructure, and growing industries, it represents one of the greatest economic opportunities in modern history. The economic potential is enormous. With full implementation of continental trade agreements, industrialization, and value-added manufacturing, Africa's combined economy could expand dramatically. Instead of exporting raw materials and importing finished goods, the continent could increasingly produce, process, and trade within its own borders, creating millions of jobs and retaining more wealth at home. Africa also possesses extraordinary natural advantages. It holds vast renewable energy potential, significant reserves of critical minerals, and a large share of the world's remaining arable land. Managed sustainably and strategically, these resources could help power global industries, while supporting food security and energy transition both within Africa and beyond. Perhaps the most important transformation would be financial independence. As domestic industries grow, tax revenues increase, and regional capital markets deepen, African countries could rely less on external borrowing and more on their own productive capacity to finance development. The purpose of this slide is not to predict exact numbers. Long-term forecasts always depend on political choices, global conditions, and effective implementation. Rather, it illustrates what becomes possible when Africa's scale is treated as an advantage, instead of a collection of fragmented markets. The central message of this entire series is simple. Africa is not poor because it lacks resources, people, or potential. It is underperforming relative to its capabilities, because too much of that potential remains disconnected. Unity is not an end in itself. It is the mechanism through which Africa can unlock the future that its people have long deserved. This presentation began with a question. Why is Africa so divided? It ends with a choice. Everything we have explored, the history, the economics, the politics, the evidence, leads to this moment. The idea of a united Africa is often dismissed as idealistic. But throughout this series, we have seen that it is grounded in measurable realities. Africa already has the institutions, the legal frameworks, the natural resources, the human capital, and the demographic momentum to become one of the defining economic powers of the 21st century. The challenge has never been possibility. It has always been implementation. Imagine a continent where African businesses treat 1.4 billion people as one market, where farmers sell to neighboring countries instead of distant continents. where engineers, doctors, entrepreneurs, and students move freely to where they are needed most, where mineral wealth is negotiated collectively, infrastructure connects rather than divides, and innovation flows across borders as easily as ideas. That is not fantasy. Every major element already exists in some form. AfCFTA has been signed. Regional free movement exists in parts of Africa. Cross-border payment systems are operating. African companies are building continental value chains. The blueprint is already on the table. The question is no longer whether African unity is possible. It is whether Africans will choose to build it. Those who benefit from division may resist change because fragmentation preserves existing advantages. But history shows that no system lasts forever when people become informed, organized, and determined to create something better. So let this be more than the end of a presentation. Let it be the beginning of a different conversation, one based not on fear, but on evidence, not on blame, but on opportunity, not on artificial borders, but on shared purpose. The African dream is not simply to remember what was lost. It is to build what has never fully existed. A continent that acts with confidence, trades with itself, invests in itself, and believes in itself. The plan exists. The evidence exists. The future remains a choice. Before you go, help this message reach more people. If you learned something new today, like the video, subscribe for more deep dives, and share this with someone who still thinks Africa is a country. Small conversations can challenge big misconceptions, and every share helps expand understanding. If you want to explore this topic further, scan the QR code for additional resources, recommended readings, maps, and extended discussions. There is far more to Africa than what can fit into a single episode, and this is only the beginning of a much deeper journey into the continent's history, cultures, people, and future. And if you'd like a deeper dive into any topic related to Africa or Pan-Africanism, leave a comment below and we'll cover it in a future video.